Hi, I'm Daniel, and I watched an entire platoon of battle-hardened soldiers laugh at a 9-year-old girl just moments before she saved all of our lives. It's funny how the people you write off are often the only ones who can pull you out of the fire. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you held the key to solving a huge problem? Before I tell you how she used a simple hairpin to fix a $1 million military radio that our comms expert had declared dead, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and go ahead and subscribe. Trust me, you are not going to want to miss the look on our expert's face when that radio suddenly crackled back to life and filled the room with the voice of our command. We were pinned down inside what was left of a 2-story farmhouse, surrounded. The initial firefight had been brutal, but now there was just this heavy, suffocating silence. You could hear the wind whistling through the bullet holes in the walls, and it sounded like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the end. We were dangerously low on ammo, down to our last canteens of water, and hope was the scarcest resource of all. The faces of the men around me were just these grim masks of exhaustion and pure, undiluted fear. Our leader, Sergeant Davis, looked like he was carrying the weight of every single one of our lives on his shoulders, and you could see in his eyes that he believed he'd already lost us. Huddled in a dusty corner, trying to make herself as small as possible, was Lena. She was a 9-year-old orphan who had latched onto our platoon weeks ago after her village was turned to rubble. To most of the guys, she was a ghost, a quiet burden we had to protect. She barely ever spoke, her large dark eyes just taking everything in. They were old eyes, the kind that had seen far too much horror for a child. For Sergeant Davis, her presence was a constant, painful reminder of our mission's failure. We were supposed to bring security, to protect the innocent, and here we were, trapped and failing to protect even this one small, silent girl who represented everything we were fighting for. Our only lifeline, our one single hope of getting out of that valley alive, was the platoon's NPRC 117G radio, and it was dead. Completely silent. It had gone dark after an RPG exploded just outside our wall, shaking the entire building and rattling our teeth. Without it, we were cut off, ghosts in a forgotten corner of the war. Command had no idea where we were or that the enemy was closing in, getting ready for the final push that we all knew would come at dawn. That radio wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was our connection to the outside world, our only chance to call for air support or extraction. Its silence was our death sentence, a ticking clock counting down our final hours. The platoon's comms specialist, Corporal Miller, was the picture of defeated arrogance. He was a guy who lived by the book, who trusted his training and his high-tech gear above all else, and now his gear had betrayed him. For the last hour, he'd been frantically working on the radio, his frustration growing with every failed attempt. He swapped the batteries, checked every inch of the antenna, ran all the diagnostics the field manual suggested, and even tried a hard reset more times than I could count. Finally, he slammed his hand on the metal casing and threw his tools down in disgust. "It's junk," he spat, his voice cracking with fury and despair. "The motherboard's fried, it's over, we're on our own." The silence that followed Miller's announcement was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. It was the sound of 17 men accepting their fate. You could see the last flicker of hope die in their eyes as they slumped against the walls, each one lost in his own grim thoughts. But while the rest of us were drowning in that silence, Lena was watching. She hadn't taken her eyes off Miller and the radio for a second, but her gaze wasn't one of fear. It was analytical, intensely focused. She was watching him the way her father, a radio repairman, must have taught her to watch a machine, not just looking at the broken parts, but understanding the entire system. Then, in that suffocating silence, a small sound broke the spell. It was the rustle of fabric as Lena, the little girl in the corner, got to her feet. Every head turned. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed completely out of place in our world of sharp, tactical movements. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty floorboards, her eyes fixed on the dead radio. It wasn't the movement of a scared child seeking comfort. It was the purposeful stride of someone with a job to do. The air grew even thicker, charged with a new kind of tension. We weren't just waiting for the enemy anymore. We were all watching this tiny girl walk toward the very machine that had sealed our fate. As Lena got within arm's reach of the radio, Corporal Miller shot up from the wall where he'd been slumped. "Hey, I told you to get back," he hissed, his voice a nasty mix of anger and humiliation. His own failure was a raw wound, and the sight of this child approaching the complex military hardware he couldn't fix felt like she was rubbing salt in it. "That's $1 million piece of equipment, not a toy. You'll break it worse than it already is." His words were like stones thrown in a quiet pond, filled with the condescending authority of an adult who sees a child as nothing more than a potential mess to be cleaned up. He took a step toward her, ready to physically shoo her away. But before Miller could reach her, Sergeant Davis held up a hand, his movements slow and heavy with exhaustion. "Let her be, Miller," he said, his voice a low rasp. There was no hope in his tone, just a profound weariness. It wasn't that he believed she could do anything, it was that he had nothing left to lose. "What's the difference now? The expert says it's dead, the book says it's dead. What else can we do? Let her look." That permission was the most damning thing of all. It wasn't a vote of confidence. It was an act of final, complete surrender. He was letting a child play with our only lifeline because, in his mind, our lives were already over. It was a gesture of pity, not opportunity. A few of the younger soldiers let out quiet, nervous snorts of laughter, quickly stifling them when they saw the look on my face. Most of the men, however, just watched with a kind of morbid curiosity. They looked at Lena the way you'd look at a stray dog, with a mixture of pity and detachment. I felt a hot flush of shame for them, for all of us. We were battle-hardened soldiers, trained to face down death, and here we were, mocking a child because our own expertise had failed us. In that moment, her quiet dignity felt more powerful than all our weapons and training combined. We were the ones who looked pathetic, drowning in our own arrogance and despair while she stood there, focused and unafraid. Lena ignored them all. She didn't seem to hear Miller's insults or register the soldiers' dismissive stares. She knelt beside the silent radio, but she didn't touch the controls or the screen. Instead, she did something none of us could have predicted. She closed her eyes. She leaned forward until her cheek was almost touching the cold metal casing, and then gently placed her ear against it. She just stayed there perfectly still, listening. It was such a strange, intimate gesture. Miller scoffed loudly. "Oh, this is great. She's listening for its ghost. We're saved." It was a cruel joke, but nobody laughed this time. The sight of her, so calm and focused, had cast a strange spell over the room. After a long moment, she straightened up. She didn't try to power it on or run a diagnostic. Instead, she began running her small, delicate fingertips over the radio's surface. She traced every seam, every port, and every connector with a slow, methodical touch. Her fingers were like sensors, feeling for something that our eyes couldn't see. It was the complete opposite of Miller's frantic, by-the-book approach. He had attacked the radio with tools and procedures, trying to force it to obey. Lena was treating it like a living thing, trying to understand where it was hurt. She wasn't trying to fix a machine. She was trying to heal it. I remembered her telling me once that her father said every machine has a voice. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. Her fingers stopped hovering over the main power connector, the very one Miller had checked and rechecked a dozen times. She didn't pull at it or try to jam it in further. She just rested her index finger on it, her head tilted as if concentrating on a faint, distant sound. Miller rolled his eyes, a theatrical gesture of impatience. "Are we done with the magic show?" he muttered to the man next to him, just loud enough for most of us to hear. "We're wasting daylight. We should be setting up better defensive positions, not watching this." The injustice of it was thick in the air. He was so blinded by his own wounded pride that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. Someone who wasn't bound by his rules was trying to find a different kind of answer. Then, with a resolve that silenced the entire room, Lena did something. She didn't look up at Miller or acknowledge his bitter comment in any way. Her focus was absolute. She gently gripped the heavy-duty power connector with both of her small hands and pulled. It came loose with a dry, grating sound, not the clean disengagement you'd expect. It was a subtle thing, a detail that Miller, in his frantic by-the-book diagnostics, had either missed or dismissed as irrelevant. But to Lena, it was clearly a signal. She held the thick cable in her lap, her brow furrowed in concentration. Miller let out an exasperated sigh, but this time it was laced with a tiny thread of uncertainty. The absolute confidence he'd shown before was beginning to fray at the edges. She didn't have a tactical light or any of the gear Miller had been using. Instead, she crawled over to a jagged hole in the wall where a single pale beam of moonlight cut through the darkness. She held the metal end of the connector up to that sliver of light, turning it over and over, her eyes squinting with an intensity that was almost painful to watch. The rest of us were just shadows holding our breath. I could feel my own heart thumping against my ribs, a stupid, frantic drumbeat of hope I was trying to suppress. After all the training, all the technology, all our strength, our fate was now resting in the hands of a 9-year-old girl examining a plug in the moonlight. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. Miller couldn't take it anymore. He shot to his feet, his frustration boiling over into pure rage. "What are you even looking for? I told you, I checked. That connection 3 times, it's clean." He took a step forward, his hand outstretched as if to snatch the cable from her. "Give me that before you—" But he never finished the sentence. "Stand down, Corporal." Sergeant Davis's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. It wasn't loud, but it was filled with a cold, hard authority that stopped Miller dead in his tracks. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The sergeant wasn't just tolerating this anymore. He was defending her right to try. He was choosing her intuition over his expert's protocol. Miller froze, his face a mask of disbelief and wounded pride. For a second, I thought he might actually challenge the order, but the look in the sergeant's eyes was absolute. Miller clenched his fists, then slowly, grudgingly stepped back into the shadows, his glare burning a hole in the back of Lena's head. The rest of the men exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer just a strange sideshow. The sergeant had drawn a line in the yatai sand. Now we weren't just watching a child. We were watching our leader's last, desperate gamble. The weight of that unspoken command settled over the room, a heavy blanket of expectation that fell squarely on Lena's small, determined shoulders. She, however, seemed completely unaware of the drama unfolding behind her. She remained focused on the connector in her hand. Then she did something that made no sense to any of us. She reached up to her hair, her fingers finding a small, simple metal hair clip, the kind any little girl might wear. She unfastened it and held it in her palm, its simple, mundane form a stark contrast to the complex military hardware it was about to interact with. A few of the guys shifted uncomfortably. Was this some kind of superstition? A good luck charm? I heard someone behind me mutter, "What's she gonna do with that? Pick the lock?" The comment wasn't mean-spirited like Miller's had been. It was just genuinely confused. We were so far beyond our training. Manuals that a hairpin felt like an alien artifact. With the focus and steady hand of a bomb disposal expert, Lena used the tip of her hair clip to carefully probe inside the female end of the power connector. Her movements were tiny, precise, and deliberate. She wasn't scraping or forcing anything. She was just feeling, exploring the internal landscape of the plug in a way that our bulky tools and impatient hands never could. The silence in the room was so complete, so fragile, that I could hear the faint metallic tink as the end of her hair clip touched one of the internal pins. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock you didn't even know was there. Every soldier in that room was leaning forward, holding their breath, their eyes glued to her small hands. After a moment, she pulled the hair clip out. She turned the connector upside down and gave it a gentle tap. Something fell out onto her dusty palm, a speck so tiny and dark it was almost invisible in the gloom. It looked like nothing more than a single grain of sand. She looked at it for a fraction of a second, her expression unreadable, before she casually opened her hand and blew it away. It vanished into the dust on the floorboards, an insignificant problem solved by an insignificant girl. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't look to any of us for approval. She simply turned back to the radio, the heavy plug held firmly in her hands, ready to reconnect it. The moment of truth had arrived. With the focus and steady hand of a bomb disposal expert, Lena used the tip of her hair clip to carefully probe inside the female end of the power connector. Her movements were tiny, precise, and deliberate. She wasn't scraping or forcing anything. She was just feeling, exploring the internal landscape of the plug in a way that our bulky tools and impatient hands never could. The silence in the room was so complete, so fragile, that I could hear the faint metallic tink as the end of her hair clip touched one of the internal pins. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock you didn't even know was there. Every soldier in that room was leaning forward, holding their breath, their eyes glued to her small hands. After a moment, she pulled the hair clip out. She turned the connector upside down and gave it a gentle tap. Something fell out onto her dusty palm, a speck so tiny and dark it was almost invisible in the gloom. It looked like nothing more than a single grain of sand. She looked at it for a fraction of a second, her expression unreadable, before she casually opened her hand and blew it away. It vanished into the dust on the floorboards, an insignificant problem solved by an insignificant girl. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't look to any of us for approval. She simply turned back to the radio, the heavy plug held firmly in her hands, ready to reconnect it. The moment of truth had arrived. Lena held the connector for a moment, aligning it with the port. Her movements were fluid and certain, completely lacking the hesitant, fumbling quality you'd expect from a child handling heavy military gear. She didn't glance at the sergeant for approval, or at Miller for a reaction. Her entire world had narrowed to the plug in her hands and the silent machine in front of her. The rest of us might as well have been ghosts. With a steady, two-handed push, she began to seat the connector. The air in the room became so thick you could feel it pressing on your skin. Every eye was locked on her hands. The collective hope of 17 desperate men was focused on that single point of connection, a silent, unified prayer sent into the dusty, moonlit air of that ruined farmhouse. It was a fragile, impossible hope. Then we heard it, a solid, satisfying click. It was a sound so different from the dry, grating noise it had made when she pulled it out. This was the clean, firm sound of a perfect connection, of metal seating exactly where it was designed to be. It was the sound of something being made right. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the room, a wave of sound that was almost as loud as the click itself. I saw Sergeant Davis's shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, straightened by a fraction of an inch. Even Miller, who had been leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed in a posture of pure defiance, took an involuntary step forward. That one small sound had changed the energy in the room completely, replacing the heavy blanket of despair with a sharp electric jolt of possibility. For a heart-stopping second, that was it. The click echoed in the silence, and then nothing. The screen remained dark. The speakers remained silent. The small green power indicator light stayed lifeless. The fragile bubble of hope that had inflated in the room popped instantly, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was even more profound and crushing than before. You could physically feel the despair returning. Heavier this time because it had been briefly lifted. I glanced over at Miller. A slow, cruel smirk was spreading across his face, a look of vindicated arrogance. It was the look of a man who was almost happy they were all going to die, just so he could be proven right. He was about to speak, to deliver the final condescending "I told you so," but Lena wasn't looking at him. She didn't seem to register the renewed despair in the room at all. Her gaze was fixed on the radio's control panel. Her expression was still one of intense, unbothered concentration, as if this was just another step in a process she already understood completely. She hadn't expected it to power on by itself. With that same deliberate calm, she reached out one small finger and firmly pressed the main power button. It was a simple, confident gesture, the complete opposite of Miller's earlier frantic, repetitive jabs at the same button. He had been trying to bully the machine into working through brute force and protocol. She was simply waking it up, as if she knew it had just been sleeping and was now ready to respond to a gentle touch. I found myself holding my breath, my chest aching. My logical mind, the part of me that had been trained for months, was screaming that this was impossible. A fried motherboard doesn't just fix itself. A dead radio doesn't come back to life because a little girl blew a speck of dust out of a plug. It was insane. But the other part of me, the part that had seen the quiet, confidence in her eyes and the steady certainty in her hands, was clinging to a sliver of irrational hope. I was rooting for her with every fiber of my being, not just because our lives depended on it, but because I desperately wanted to see that smug, arrogant look wiped off Miller's face. I wanted to believe that sometimes the answers aren't in the manual. The moment stretched into an eternity. The only light in the room was that single pale beam of moonlight, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air. The only sound was the wind whistling its mournful tune through the bullet holes. Sergeant Davis stood frozen, his face a stone mask, but I could see the pulse throbbing in his neck. He looked like a man on the brink of an abyss, unsure if he was about to be pulled back or pushed over the edge. Miller's smirk had hardened into a sneer. He opened his mouth, the first syllable of some final dismissive insult already forming on his lips. The other soldiers had receded into the shadows, their faces pale and drawn, their hope completely extinguished. The room felt cold, like a tomb where the last candle had just been snuffed out. Just as Miller started to speak, Lena did one last thing. She raised her hand and gently, almost lovingly, tapped the side of the radio's metal casing twice. It wasn't a frustrated bang like Miller had done. It was a soft, rhythmic tap-tap, like knocking on a door to let someone know you're there. It was a gesture of familiarity, of intimacy, with the machine. It was the kind of thing her father, the repairman, must have done 1,000 times, a final little nudge to settle a loose connection or wake up a sleepy component. It was a completely unscientific, deeply human action. In that final, silent moment, it felt less like a repair and more like an appeal, a quiet request from one small, determined heart to the cold, silent heart of the machine. And then, after that second soft tap, it happened. A single green pixel flickered to life on the radio's dark screen. It was so small, so faint that at first I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But then another one lit up, and another. A low electronic hum, barely audible, began to emanate from the machine, a sound we hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. A collective sharp gasp sucked the air out of the room. I saw Miller's sneering mouth freeze mid-word, his eyes widening in disbelief. The impossible was happening. The ghost in the machine was waking up. It wasn't the sound of a manual-driven repair. It was the slow, organic return of a pulse, a heartbeat where there had been only silence and death. The screen didn't just flicker. It suddenly flooded with a pale green light, illuminating Lena's small, determined face. The hum escalated into a roar, and then the speaker exploded with a deafening blast of static. It was a harsh, violent sound that made us all flinch, but it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It wasn't just noise. It was the sound of a connection, of a pathway being violently torn back open. It was the sound of our isolation being shattered. After hours of suffocating silence, that raw, chaotic static was the sound of life itself, of a chance we no longer believed we had. It filled every corner of that dusty, broken room, washing away the despair and replacing it with a stunning, painful, glorious hope. Just as quickly as it started, the static cut out, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. And into that void, a voice dropped. It was clear, calm and professional, so alien to our desperate reality that it felt like it was coming from another universe. Viper 1, this is Command. We've been trying to reach you. Report your status. Over. The words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown across an impossible distance. It was salvation, delivered in the mundane, procedural language of the military. The voice was real. We were no longer ghosts. We were no longer alone. The world outside this tomb knew we were here, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we knew we were going to live. The entire platoon was frozen, statues of dirt and sweat. No one moved. No one dared to breathe, as if a single sound might sever the fragile connection. The men stared, their eyes wide with a shock that went beyond simple surprise. They looked from the glowing screen of the radio to the tiny, 9-year-old girl standing beside it, and back again. The reality of what had just happened was too immense to process. Their training, their experience, their certainty of death, all of it had been overturned in a single moment by a child with a hairpin. The laws of their world had just been rewritten, and they were struggling to read the new text. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated awe that bordered on fear. Corporal Miller, the expert, looked like he'd been struck by lightning. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of utter bewilderment. His face was pale, his confidence completely shattered. He took a clumsy step backward, bumping into the wall, his eyes never leaving the radio. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had followed every procedure in the book and failed, then back at Lena. The foundation of his world, his training, his expertise, his superiority, had crumbled to dust. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. Finally, he managed to choke out a single whispered word that was swallowed by the silence. How? It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man's entire worldview collapsing. Sergeant Davis, who had been a pillar of grim acceptance, finally broke. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of such profound relief it was almost a sob. I watched as a single tear escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the layers of grime and exhaustion on his cheek. It was a tear of gratitude, of disbelief, of a weight being lifted that was so heavy it had nearly crushed him. He didn't look at the radio anymore. His eyes were fixed on Lena. He wasn't looking at a refugee child or a burden he had to protect. He was looking at her with the kind of reverence a man holds for something holy, something that has stepped in and defied the very nature of death itself. The spell broke. Sergeant Davis snatched the handset, his voice thick with emotion but steady as he barked our coordinates and situation into the radio. "Command, this is Viper 1. We are surrounded. Taking fire. Need immediate. Extraction and air support over." As he spoke, the energy in the room transformed. The shock melted away, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated joy and awe. The soldiers were no longer looking at Lena with pity or annoyance. They were looking at their savior. Their gazes held a mixture of deep respect and a profound, humbling shame for their earlier dismissal. And Lena? She simply watched the sergeant, a faint, knowing smile on her lips, before calmly taking the hairpin and clipping it back into her hair. The job was done. The whir of the helicopter blades was the first sound from the outside world that didn't want us dead. As Sergeant Davis coordinated our extraction over the radio, a new kind of order settled over the platoon. The men moved with purpose, setting up a perimeter for the landing zone, but their movements were different. Every few seconds, one of them would glance back at Lena, who was now sitting on an old crate, quietly observing the organized chaos she had unleashed. They looked at her with a mixture of awe and profound shame that was almost painful to watch. They weren't just looking at the girl who saved them, they were looking at a living, breathing testament to their own blindness, their own arrogance. In that dusty farmhouse, we weren't just soldiers waiting for rescue. We were students in a classroom where the teacher was a 9-year-old girl. Corporal Miller was a ghost. He stood apart from everyone, leaning against the far wall, his face ashen. He kept looking from his own hands to the now thrumming radio, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. His entire identity, built on manuals, procedures, and a sense of technical superiority, had been dismantled by a child with a hairpin. I saw him take a step toward her once, his mouth opening as if to ask the question that was burning him alive. How? But he stopped. What could she possibly say that he would understand? Her language wasn't one of schematics and diagnostics. It was one of listening, of feeling, of intuition. He was an expert in a world of rules, and she had just shown him that sometimes the most critical rules aren't written down anywhere. He was defeated not by the enemy, but by a truth he couldn't comprehend. Before the choppers got too close, Sergeant Davis walked over to Lena. He didn't say a word. He just knelt in front of her, the big, battle-weary man looking up at the small, quiet child. The entire platoon stopped to watch. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached up and began to undo the stitches holding his platoon patch to his sleeve. It was the insignia of our unit, a symbol of our identity, our brotherhood, our shared hardship. It was everything we were. He carefully removed it and, holding it in his calloused palm, gently pressed it into her small hand. He closed her fingers around it. It wasn't a medal or a commendation. It was a piece of his soul, the highest honor he could possibly give. He was telling her, in the only way he knew how, that she was one of us now, forever. When the thumping of the rotors grew so loud it shook the dust from the rafters, the first rescue chopper descended into the clearing outside. The ramp came down, and 2 medics ran toward us. The soldiers instinctively formed a human corridor, not for the wounded, but for Lena. They shielded her from the rotor wash with their own bodies. When the sergeant scooped her up into his arms, no one was surprised. He carried her toward the helicopter, not like a refugee he was saving, but like a precious dignitary he was escorting from a war zone. The medics looked confused, seeing this grizzled sergeant carrying an uninjured child with such reverence, while wounded men waited their turn. They didn't understand. They hadn't been there. They hadn't seen the miracle. As we lifted off, I looked down at the ruined farmhouse, a tomb that had almost claimed us. I saw the dead radio we'd left behind, now just a piece of junk again. The real magic hadn't been in the machine, it had been in the person who understood it. On the flight back to base, Lena fell asleep in the sergeant's lap, her small hand still clenched tightly around the platoon patch. The men sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. We had survived, but we were not the same platoon that had been trapped in that valley. We had gone in as soldiers who trusted our gear and our training above all else. We came out as men who had learned a humbling, unforgettable lesson about where true strength and true genius can be found. That day was never officially recorded in any after-action report. How could it be? Platoon saved by orphan girl with a hairpin. They would have sent us all for psych evaluations. But for every man who walked out of that farmhouse alive, it's a story we carry with us every single day. It changed how we saw the world, how we saw expertise, and how we saw the people everyone else writes off. We learned that the most important signals aren't always sent over a radio, and that the most brilliant solutions often come from the places you've been taught to ignore. We were saved not by a weapon or a tactic, but by a quiet little girl who knew how to listen. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-belief, please share this video with them. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thanks for listening. That day was never officially recorded in any after-action report. How could it be? Platoon saved by orphan girl with a hairpin. They would have sent us all for psych evaluations. The official story was that a temporary fault in the power connector was identified and resolved by Corporal Miller, who received a commendation for his calm under pressure. We all signed the report without a word of protest. Miller never looked any of us in the eye again. The real story wasn't written on paper. It was etched into the memory of every man who walked out of that farmhouse alive. It's a story we carry with us every single day, a silent pact we share. We learned that the truth isn't always what's documented. Sometimes it's what you carry in your heart, a heavy, humbling secret that changes you forever. Corporal Miller was a ghost of a man on the flight back. He sat apart from everyone, his gaze fixed on the floor of the helicopter, his hands resting limply in his lap. His entire world, a fortress built on manuals, procedures, and the certainty of his training, had been leveled by a 9-year-old girl. He couldn't process it. To him, what Lena did wasn't genius. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the universe that his logical mind couldn't compute. A week after we returned to base, he requested a transfer to a logistics unit, a desk job as far away from frontline technology as he could get. He wasn't running from the war. He was running from the memory of a little girl who had shown him that his expertise, his entire identity, was built on a foundation of sand. He was a man defeated not by the enemy, but by a truth he refused to understand. Sergeant Davis, however, found a new purpose. In that farmhouse, he hadn't just been saved from death, he'd been saved from the crushing despair that had hollowed him out. He saw Lena not as a reminder of his failure, but as a symbol of a hope he thought was long dead. He never let her go. When our tour ended, he started the long, difficult process of adopting her. He fought through mountains of paperwork and military bureaucracy with the same tenacity he used to fight the enemy. He brought her home. Lena gave him a reason to live for something beyond the next mission, a reason to be a father instead of just a soldier. She had fixed more than just a radio that day. She had fixed the broken parts of a good man's soul. As for me, I learned more about strength and wisdom in those few hours than in all my years of training. I learned that we are conditioned to look for answers in the most obvious places, from the experts, the leaders, the people with the right titles and the expensive gear. We're taught to dismiss the quiet ones, the outsiders, the people who don't fit the mold. We went into that valley believing our technology and our training made us strong, but we discovered that true strength often comes from the places we've been taught to ignore. The most powerful signals aren't always sent over a wire. Sometimes they come from a quiet heart that simply knows how to listen when the rest of the world is screaming. If this story reminds you of someone who feels invisible but has a quiet strength the world desperately needs to see, please share this video with them. It might be the message they need to hear today. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the unsung heroes all around us, the ones who prove that your value is never determined by who other people think you are. Thank you for listening.